As we move on to the next part of the today's celebrations and the Foundation Day and our technical topic seminars, we are moving to the first technical session, and I'm very pleased and privileged to introduce our first speaker, Shargiil Bashir. Shargiil Bashir is the Chief Sustainability Officer and Executive Vice President at First Abu Dhabi Bank. In this role, Shargiil is responsible for developing, leading, and implementing the bank's ESG strategy and initiatives. He was among the main drivers behind FAB joining the UN-convened Net Zero Banking Alliance as the first bank in the UAE and GCC to make a net zero commitment by 2050. He is a seasoned banker and experienced leader with over 20 years of experience. He has led various aspects of corporate governance, strategy, risk management, risk assurance, and sustainability throughout multiple countries. Before joining FAB in November 2020, Shargiil held various senior leadership positions at Danske Bank based in Denmark. Shargiil holds a Bachelor of Business Administration and an Executive MBA from the Copenhagen Business School in Denmark and has completed executive education at INSEAD in France. Please join me in welcoming Shargiil over the dais, please. Welcome, Shargiil.
Thank you very much for this invitation to speak today. This is my first time joining this gathering, and just understanding of this chapter and the long history, it's really a privilege that I've been invited here to speak about sustainability and ESG, a topic very close to my heart, a topic that is extremely interesting and has become very vocal and important over the past years as well. So I hope that I can share a little bit light about the background and how are the challenges within sustainability and which direction they're going to take. I think I'll have around 30 minutes. I'll try to spend around 20 minutes on the presentation and leave around 10 minutes for questions. So please let me know when we get there if you have any thoughts or questions or comments to the presentation. The topics I will discuss today is going to be about ESG and climate change. I'm going to discuss about sustainable financing, and I'm going to touch upon ESG risks and why they are important for organizations to address as well. So just, I'm sure everybody knows this in this audience, but just to remind everyone that what is ESG? E stands for the environment aspects. Typically the risks we see here, the importance will be around waste management. It's about climate change, change in temperatures, change in weather, biodiversity, food security. When we then look at the S part, it's more about the topics that are more often seen as softs, but topics like data protection, health and safety, topics like human rights and the social impact. And finally, governance is about AML, it is about bribery, it's about having a strong governance in your organization, having the policies, having the frameworks about how to lead a sustainable business, but also be without the limits and the legal requirements as well. Why is ESG important? So ESG and sustainability has been a topic that was nice to have, right? Like corporate social responsibility is a topic that we have spoken about for many, many years, right? How do you contribute to the society? What is the impact your organization is creating? So where does ESG differentiate to that mindset? The main topic where ESG differentiates is that ESG is a more of an umbrella and a holistic topic compared to social responsibility, which is kind of your social impact of the organization. So why has this become so important in the past years that everybody's speaking about it and everybody's focusing about it? The reason is that now we see ESG as an opportunity, a need to have, where we previously saw it as a nice to have. The reason being that now we are seeing customers who are willing to pay a higher price for sustainable products or sustainable brands. And we have actually research and data to support this as well. Just imagine Tesla as a car, right? I think it's a common product, a brand we all aware of. Why is it that people are willing to pay a much higher price for a Tesla car to a comparable car? Okay? It has different benefits, it's a sustainable brand, it brings some add-on to the similar product. We've also now tried to see that if you're hiring the best talents, some of the questions they will ask you is about the value of your company. What is your sustainability plans? What kind of impact do you create as an organization? So in order to attract the top talents, you need to have a view around sustainability. If you look at it from investors' perspective, we expect that more than 50% of assets under management in the coming years will be linked to ESG. So investors are looking for sustainable investments, are looking for assets that are linked to ESG, looking for companies that are focusing on ESG. So if you don't have an ESG profile, if you don't have an understanding of ESG within your organization, you might not be relevant for the future investors. And finally, the regulators play an important part. We have now seen in the UK having significant regulation coming through on ESG and sustainability. We've seen in the US, we saw a bill got passed very recently, putting enhanced focus on sustainability. EU, with EU taxonomy coming through. We know that the regulators in this region is actively working on regulation on sustainability, which is going to have an impact. So this is something that we cannot avoid. And that is why we need to approach the opportunities that this creates for organization instead of looking at it from a compliance perspective. If you only look at ESG as a compliance, it's going to be costly, it's going to be difficult. You need to look at the opportunities within sustainability and ESG. This is basically how this summer went, right? This summer we saw some of the biggest climate disaster, the challenges we have seen with climate change. UK had a heat wave, some of the record high temperatures were seen in the UK this year. We saw the flooding in Pakistan, we saw a lot of wildfires happening in France, in Southern Europe. But also we have seen that drought coming through in the US. More than 40 states in the US was hit by drought this year. So we've seen significant challenges with climate change. And these are only the beginning of the challenges that are expecting to come in the coming time. This is some of the reasons that these challenges are happening. Carbon emissions, just to highlight every time, for everybody to be on the same page, carbon emissions are created every time we create something, okay? When you produce anything, there's a carbon footprint, emissions are created. And when we speak about net zero, this basically means that whatever we're gonna do, even that you become extremely efficient, you will create emissions. But in order to take those emissions away from the atmosphere, we have the oceans, we have the trees, forestation that takes those emissions away. When you balance those two things, that's what we call net zero, okay? Everything have an emission footprint, and we have seen the emissions increase more than 3 to 4 times since 1960s. At the same time, we are starting to see the global temperature rise again, okay? So there seems to be a correlation between the emission footprint we as humans are creating, the impact it's having on the global temperature. The rise of global temperature of 1 degree does not sound like a lot, but the consequence of it is what we are experiencing right now, okay? So in the past decade, we have seen a lot of climate disasters, right? Every year we see some new record-breaking climate disasters. And if this has to stop, we need to ensure how can we reduce our emissions so the global temperature does not rise more than 1.5 degrees by 2050. That's the target. If we need to have a sustainable future, a sustainable planet, we need to cap that temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. Right now, as the plans, everything that has been implemented, we are on a way to 2.5 to 2.7 degrees increase by 2050 right now. So significant measures need to be taken, and that's why we are seeing this enhanced focus on this topic. In order to address this, back in 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed at COP21. COP is the conference of parties where the countries under the UN get together and discuss the challenges around climate and how do we address this. It takes place every year. You will definitely going to hear much more about it because the COP28 is going to be in the UAE for the first time. The COP is taking place actually next week in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, which will be COP27. So having two COPs coming to the same region is very unique. Also shows the importance this region is taking on climate and sustainability. The Paris Agreement basically agreed at the time between the countries that we will try to limit the global warming to well below 2 degrees by 2050. Okay. Since then, we have not seen the impact that was expected. Now, these numbers have been recalculated to see we need to get by 1.5 degree in order to have a sustainable planet. So how does it look? So since 2015, where have we gotten? Basically, since 2015, the emissions have raised by 14% while they were supposed to decline. This basically means that we will now need to reduce our emission by 45% by 2030 in order to be on a pathway to be at that 1.5 degree by 2050. Okay? So basically, things have worsened since 2015, the Paris Agreement was signed, and now significant impacts are required. This is also why we have realized in the past 5 years that we need to have a much bigger private sector involvement. So after the Paris Agreement, we saw the governments, we saw the politicians start taking actions, developing policies that how do we address these challenges. However, we have seen now for the past 3 to 5 years, the private sector going in and playing a big role to say, this is not a challenge the government by themselves can solve. We need to have a collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in order to achieve the ambitions that we have set out and address the challenges that we are facing. This is also why that we have seen more than 70 countries commit to net zero. Basically saying that by 2050, we would have created the balance. The emission we create is the same emission we will remove from the atmosphere by 2050 to create the net zero. Okay? And here UAE was the first country in the region to commit to net zero by 2050, a very bold move from a fossil fueled economy, but also shows the ambition of UAE and the leadership of UAE to say that we know this is a challenge, and we as a leader in this field who have been focused on this can actually lead the way. If we can do it, everybody should be able to do it. And after UAE's commitment, we saw other countries in the region. We saw Saudi go out with a commitment. We saw also Bahrain coming out with a commitment. Very recently, Oman has committed as well. So we are now starting to see more and more countries putting the plans and pathways that how are we going to achieve this. Okay? And basically, you start breaking it down to say, okay, now the countries have committed, we need companies to commit as well. That's why we have seen the First Movers Coalition, which is some of the biggest companies in the world going out and committing to this and say, we are going to support this initiative. These are the plans we have put in place. You have the kind of Amazon, the Google, Apple, so on, going out with these kind of commitments as well. And it's important to remember, these are just not empty commitments. You need to disclose your plan. You need to have it verified. It needs to be based on science. So it's not like, we will do a little bit here and there. You actually need to follow and disclose how you're going to achieve this as well. And you try to look into some of the International Energy Agency's projections and so on to say your targets, how will they fulfill, and what kind of impact they will create as well. Moving on, that how can we address this? What are the challenges? What are the investments needed? And then we move on to the sustainable finance discussion. So basically, we have seen around 1.6 trillion of sustainable finance debt being issued in 2021 of the total market of 4 trillion. Okay? which is a big increase. We are starting to see green bonds. We are starting to see sustainability-linked loans coming in place. We are seeing different financial instruments to support the sustainability topic going forward. However, though this is a great achievement and a great number that has been achieved, the need is somewhere between 3 to 5 trillion annually by 2030 in order to achieve this reduction of 45%, which I highlighted before. So basically what needs to happen is that we need to invest in sustainable projects. We need to invest in renewable energy, solar panels, windmills, other important topics regarding sustainability that can change, we can focus on mitigation, adaptation. How do we secure that? That is what is required. The expectation is that by 2025, roughly 53 trillion of ESG investments will be out there, which is basically a third of the total investments. That's also why we are seeing a big shift of global investments moving towards sustainability, because when you look at all the long-term trends, sustainability is one of the key things that needs to be focused around. Can you click the next slide for me, please? There it is. Perfect. So what do we need to do in order to close this gap? There's something that the policymakers can do, right? We need to create incentives in order to do sustainable investments, to finance these sustainability projects. This can be that there are two ways to do this typically. You can penalize or you can create incentives. We have seen the European Union with the EU taxonomy coming out. We are having capital discussions that companies who will not invest sustainable, they will have some additional capital requirements coming to their side. They must need to hold more capital because the risk of the climate change that will hit them will be bigger. But you can also create incentives. You can create that if you do green investments, you will get some incentives from the government perspective in order to do so. It might be that if you're labeled as a green company, you can pay less taxes. So we are seeing many different options being looked into from governments in order to address this. We also need the financial institutions to take a bigger role and support this. Sustainability and ESG is a long-term challenge. The changes we will do and implement today is going to benefit the future generations. Okay? I think there was a very good example made in the keynote speech about the fitness, right? When you go to a gym every day, you might not see the big change, but when you see it over 3 months, you see the change. That's the same thing we need to do with sustainable investments. The small changes we do today, you might not see them, but if everybody makes those small changes, this is going to have a big impact. And that's the role of financial institutions and corporates to go out and support these changes. Whatever you do, try to see what kind of sustainable angle does this have. Next time your company is developing a product, to say, okay, what's the sustainability angle on this? Can we do a recycling packaging of this product? Can we look at it from a different aspect in order to create that sustainability link to it? Right now, we are seeing that the governments and the private sector will need to issue around $5 trillion of green bonds or green financial instruments by 2025. So again, there's a big opportunity out there in order to do so. I'm sure that all the companies you are associated with are looking into these opportunities, but this is the opportunity. Don't think about sustainability as a compliance aspect. Look at the opportunity this is going to create, because this is a trend that is so vital from a government and the private sector. But it's also important to look at it from a risk perspective from your organization. Some of the risks that have been highlighted are drought, hurricanes, wildfire, flooding, and so on. And we might today see, oh, this doesn't really impact us or hit us, but actually do hit companies as well. We have seen very recently that a lot of the tech companies started to have their data center close to lakes, right? And they did this in order to get some sustainable cooling effects from these lakes. So a lot of advanced technology was used to say that, we can use some of the natural cooling around these data centers. The challenge is that because of climate change, these lakes are basically getting hit by drought, right? So the cooling effect you were expecting it to have, you don't have anymore, which means that your cost on cooling is increasing significantly for these companies. So again, think about that. How will the climate change hit your company? What are the risks you need to be aware of from that perspective? If you start to see flooding, we saw Fujairah this year who got hit as well. So by flooding, so what are the challenges that it will create for your organization, your company, when these kind of impacts happens? And some of the examples we have seen, Volkswagen, who claimed wrongdoing by saying that their cars lived up to all the emissions and so on. And when it was checked by the regulators, they have created a program to share wrong information. They have recently settled for $14 billion US, paid a fine of that amount because of that wrongdoing. So this creates big challenges and issues. I just mentioned the challenge that you've seen with the drought hitting some of the tech companies, the enhanced cost they're seeing from that perspective. Some of them are intentional, some of them are not intentional, but they still impact your business. But also be aware of the social risk you will see. The social risks are also increasing. So one thing is the climate change and how your environment gets hit, but ESG, as we discussed very earlier, is an umbrella of things. There's also a social impact of that. We have recently seen that Coca-Cola, who is one of the worst companies from a polluting perspective and using plastic, and had taken a long time to come with sustainable solutions to the plastic use they've had, wanted to sponsor the COP27, which is the environment conference of the year, which got extremely negative reputational impact of this. Because you cannot claim to say that we want to sponsor something and greenwash yourself into saying that, this is an important environmental topic, let's work on this, but at the same time, you are not coming with sustainable solutions to address the challenges with plastic. We've also seen the payment, the salary discussions on deliveries. There's been a lot of discussions around the World Cup being held in Qatar, the challenges that has created for the workforces over there. So there are also social risks that we need to be aware of that are linked to ESG, and they will play a bigger and bigger role going forward. So one part is the climate part, but there are also the social and governance part, which are important to address as companies. So some of the social factors to be aware of: diversity, inclusion, equality, child labor, equal pay, human rights, gender pay ratio. How you look into that part is becoming extremely important. And we are starting to see regulation coming into these topics as well. Just here locally in the UAE, we have seen the employment law coming through. We're expecting more changes to the regulation coming in the coming years to address these kind of points. So these topics are extremely important to address and look into. So again, ESG, one part is environment and climate change, but there's a bigger umbrella about who you create a sustainable business. It's all about creating an organization, a business that is sustainable for the long term and how you address that. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. No questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. My question is, as a banking community, how are you ensuring that the companies are actually not doing a lot of greenwashing as such and not putting everything on the carpet and saying we are issuing green bonds, but they're working on actually expanding the production of oil and gas or the climate dirty things as such? So how are the banking community ensuring that the companies are not doing greenwashing?
Yeah, so the topic of greenwashing is extremely interesting, right? I think from a banking perspective, the topic of greenwashing is not very different than the topic of reputational risk overall. You run a reputational risk as an organization, your client run a reputational risk as well, right? So right now, I believe that if you're the financier of Tesla, I'm sure that you're considering the reputational risk with Elon Musk now taking over Twitter, one kind of reputational risk that creates as well. So I don't think that is very different how you review that. But overall, as a banking community, how to look into the ESG risk, I think it's extremely important with your clients to sit together with them and get an understanding what ESG impact will your company face in the coming years. And look at it from the short, medium, and long term, define it as 1 to 2 years to 5 years to 10 years, right? And I think that everybody needs to look into the 2030 as the baseline kind of thing, that how would you transform your business towards 2030? Because the regulation is coming, the demand is changing. If we see the consumer development going, that the Generation X, the millennials, they're not willing to buy unsustainable products, how will this impact your organization? So I think the banking community needs to ask those questions when you're discussing with your clients, how does your plan look like? What is your sustainable strategy? What is your journey towards net zero? Please share that with us. And then you set some targets, just like you would do yourself, but how would you achieve them? I think that is the approach to take forward on that.
But is that really happening with the bank community?
Absolutely. So we have, I can speak for FAB perspective. I know a lot of the UK banks and European banks have done that already. So I've seen examples in Europe that if you're not moving into the right direction, the price you're paying is getting much higher. So we have actually seen that there are UK banks who are now asking for a higher price for companies who are not meeting their sustainable targets, who have not set the sustainable targets, to say, we're not going to finance you, or the cost is going to be significantly higher. We're not at that point in this region yet. I still think that we are probably 3 to 5 years behind that part. But in Europe and UK, that has started happening, definitely.
Thank you, Mr. Bashir, for excellent presentation. You did mention that as individuals, we should do our bit. So my question to you is, is there any source of information out there where I can easily find out which corporates are, what kind of commitments they have made, and how are they being tracked, so that I could, probably support them more?
Yeah, definitely. Internationally, there are. So there's this, I think I had it in the slides, called Race to Zero. So Race to Zero is basically the umbrella above UN, who have said that all the companies that are committing to net zero, they become a member of the Race to Zero community, basically. So when you go and look at the Race to Zero, you will see a couple of thousand companies who have committed to net zero, who have committed to set science-based targets of how they will achieve net zero. So that's the one way to do it. Regionally, I think different pledges are being made. We have now seen more than 25 companies in Abu Dhabi committing a national pledge to support the UAE's ambition on net zero, which will now start developing their plans. And we are starting to see this happening in Dubai as well. Dubai have reduced their emissions significantly over the past years. So we are starting to see these developments. At the regional level, we don't have that overview of companies as of this point, but I'm sure that over the next 12 months, going into COP28 in UAE, you're going to have that kind of a register or an overview of that.
Yeah. Very good presentation. Bashir, my question is, you took the example of Tesla as an EV company. I think, what do you think if we look at the fundamentals, how that electricity is produced? Because Tesla users are using electricity, but they have no control over how that electricity, if it is coal-fired power plants or diesel-generated power plants, we are adding to the problem.
Absolutely. I think it's a very valid point that Tesla does not control that. That comes under the control of the governments, right? So the governments need to create the plans about how they will go to net zero. So one of the things that are going to be discussed at the COP27 in Egypt next week is the phase out of coal. That how does countries commit to the phase out of coal? Right now, more than 50 countries have committed or phased out coal already. Last year at the COP at Glasgow, when that took place, it was a discussion that by next year we will see an increase of country committing to this. However, what has happened since last year in Glasgow to now is that the energy crisis in Europe, the challenge in Ukraine, that we're actually seeing Germany as one of the biggest renewable energy countries moving back towards coal in order to address their energy challenges. So again, I would say that having an expectation that, one size gonna fits all is not realistic at this point. But we need to see more countries focusing on towards renewable energy, which is happening. Just in this region, as a fossil fuel region, the renewable energy since 2012 till 2021 increased 800 times, right? 800 times we got more renewable energy over the past 10 years in this region, okay? So this is gonna increase. The solar panels are here to stay. We know that in Saudi they're exploring wind as well. Masdar is going into wind as well. So you will see the alternatives coming, but still you will have the fossil fuel, you are gonna have the coal for some time in order to make a responsible transition to the green future. So I think that you will need to find a solution that how do you move towards that phase? And it is gonna be a phased approach. We can't, our energy system is not that we can put on and off on fossil fuels, right? So you need to make a sustainable transition, and that is gonna take some time. But what is required right now that we have a view on the plan, how that plan is gonna look like. And I think that is important.
Thank you. Hi, Shargiil. So, it's Amir. Thank you for your presentation. I would say you have covered more than the basics. There is a notion that it only covers the environment aspect, but there is a wider social aspect. My question here is, since UAE has committed an ambitious target of net zero by 2050, and considering the fact that almost above 80% are SMEs in UAE, and you said that the private companies have to play a big part in this. So do you have any thoughts on how SMEs should consider this and any practical insights on how they can contribute to this mission?
Absolutely. So SMEs, the expectation is right now that of the total emission in UAE, around 25% will be SMEs. And then you have a lot of government entities, larger corporates who place for the rest of the part. The SMEs will need to make this transition as well, of course. Right now, I think that the bigger SMEs start to need thinking about the obvious changes they can create as part of their business model. What are the low-hanging fruits you can look into? It could be change of your fleet. How can you go more into the electric vehicle setup as well? That is one way to do this. We are also seeing now opening both in Abu Dhabi and Dubai for more use of renewable energy. So how do you transform towards renewable energy as well? But I think the key part is for the SMEs to start saying what kind of footprint do we have right now from an emissions perspective, right? And there are a lot of free tools out there where you put in your electricity bill, your gas bill, and so on, that can help you calculate that what are your emissions right now. Because it's difficult to know where you're going if you don't know your starting point, right? So if you get an understanding of what kind of footprint we as an SME is having, what kind of impact we're having, then this will happen anyhow. And for the SME part, an important point is that SMEs are the part of the value chain for the bigger companies, right? So a lot of the SMEs, you guys will know, are probably part of the supply chain for ADNOC, right? For Mubadala, for FAB, MBD, other big companies, right? And for order for them to get to net zero, their supply chain will need to get to net zero. So at some point, they will feel the pressure in order to get there. We have started to see, so as an example, Apple came out just last week to say, all our supply chain need to be net zero by 2030. If you're not net zero, you can't be a supplier to Apple, right? And this includes companies in Taiwan, China, everything, right? So that kind of pressure will start coming from the bigger companies. So if you as an SME already know your baseline, you know that what are the steps you will need to take to get there.
Just a follow-up question, but is there any tool that we can use to calculate the?
Yes, there's tools called MyCarbon. There's the greenhouse gas protocol on their website where you can go and calculate as well. Some of the challenges will be that they're not very specific to the UAE market as of this point, which is coming. I know that the Ministry of Climate Change is working on a specific tool for the UAE market as well. The Dubai financial regulator has a tool for SMEs specifically, actually, which you can go and test out as well.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sorry, it's a more mundane question, Mr. Bashir. As a consumer, I see a lot of brands which are touting to be ESG compliant, or they charge a premium because they claim to be superior ESG adherers. How do I validate this? Is there a global certification of some sort to say that this is an ESG compliant to X percentage or whatever? Is there something of that sort?
At this point, there's not kind of a global certificate for that. We have starting to see in Europe that you are getting an EU certification to basically say that this company is living up to the standards basically that has been set out. We're starting to see that coming in Europe, but at this point, there's not a global certification that if you buy a product from company A, that has been certified or not. That does not exist at this point, unfortunately.
Well, I want to bring an example back home. So we have ban on single-use plastic, but the implementation is disaster because you and I go to supermarket, you buy veggies, you get single-use plastic. You and I go and buy water bottles, they are all single-use plastic. We just cheat ourselves that we refill them. You get your milk, which is single-use plastic bottles. When do we really implement what we say?
I think it's a very good point, right? So it's always a question of how quickly can you change human behavior, right? And again, I think it comes a little bit back to the point I made with fossil fuel. It's not a question of on-off. I think, again, every time you implement this kind of a policy, you need to think about what's the step you take. I think it was a very bold move from Abu Dhabi to go and ban single-use plastic earlier this year, and it needs to be followed up, right? So it's not that, that was the first step that was taken, right? When you went out shopping in Lulu or Kafur, you would have these multiple bags you brought with you. That is the first step you take away. And then you can start enhancing on that. Is the similar good question about that, if the electricity you're using, it coming from coal, is that good or is it bad, right? But what you can impact is the first step you take, and then everything else needs to follow. Again, I think the single-use plastic, the water bottle, is something that you could easily get rid of. We are starting to see some very good initiatives coming through in Dubai who are looking into this part. But we just got to remember this is human behavior. Things will take time. You can't just do it overnight. But I have seen in the past 2 years many more policies and changes being implemented than I have seen in the past 5 years, right? So things are moving. Are they moving fast enough? Absolutely not. Can we do much more? Absolutely. But I also would just like to say that, we can also as individuals make a difference, right? Your air conditioning the home, increase 1 degree of temperature, that will probably reduce your emission by 15%, right? It's those small kind of things. When you're showering, remember to turn off the water at time to time, right? When you're washing your clothes, you do it a few times or get a bigger bunch of clothes getting washed. So all these kind of small things is something we can do. Recycling, right? Today, very few people recycle here. But you have so many free options where you can get people to come and pick up your plastic, etc., which is not just going out and polluting, but is actually getting reused as well. So there have come so many different options for food that can be used and utilized, which we can impact as individuals, I think, which are extremely important. And then the policy makers will do this, because remember, the government and the country has committed, right? So they will definitely come as well, but they will need the support from the community as well, and that's where we can play a part. Okay. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Shargiil. I request you to please be on the stage. What an amazing session. I think we are more curious and more want to know about it, but due to the paucity of time, we have to restrict the questions here. Thank you so much, Shargiil, for such an amazing presentation. I think This was a reminder and an eye-opener that ESG is no longer good to have, but it is something that is going to becoming a need to have. And we should look at ESG not as a compliance, but as what opportunities are lying there for all the organizations here. So thank you so much. As a token of appreciation, I'd like to request Chapter General Secretary Rohit Daima to please join us on stage, and past Chairman Ashish Bhandari as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.